Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Yomi Answers. It's been a little bit since our last episode, but we have two questions submitted by, my viewers out there, and both are kind of related to kind of industry things this time around. So I'm gonna answer these two, and today we're gonna start with the first question, which is: would it be better to have more characters on release and less DLC, or less characters on release and more DLC? And so the answer to this question kind of depends on whether you're a consumer or you're a developer. And so I think as time goes on, the roster size is something that becomes more and more important to fighting games on release. Like, people generally just want a lot of characters to choose from. And so, like, even some modern examples have been given very high praise for having large starting rosters. Like, Tekken's starting roster is pretty big. On the other side, like, Street Fighter kind of got shit because their starting roster was quote unquote small, right? And I think like some of like historical fighting games kind of get modern games in trouble because like everyone wants to talk about like Marvel 2, right? Everyone always just talks about Marvel 2. Marvel 2 had like what, like between 50 and 60 characters or some shit, something insane, right? It's just unrealistic. It's just unrealistic. Especially when we consider that like not all characters release with the same quality, right? Like, some characters are much more complicated and much more thought out than others. And so like you need to find a middle ground that is like able to satisfy like people that want a lot of characters to choose from on start, but then at the same time, that is the purpose of DLC, is to give you more time. So that if you have an idea that maybe you couldn't finish during initial dev time, you could still release it later, and keep the life cycle going. Me personally, I would rather have like a smaller roster of more in-depth characters, than like a big roster of mediocre characters. Like, if they're a bunch of characters but they're very shallow, then that doesn't mean much to me. But if it's a lot of characters that have a lot of depth to them and there's lots of things to explore, then like you get a lot of longevity out of that just by learning about the characters themselves, and then also the matchups will be more complicated from like a gameplay standpoint. So like I don't know, I think I would prefer that. But everyone loves characters, and like whenever we're talking about games with any type of IP to them, there will always be a legion of characters that are not in the game that people want in the game for this or that. Like, even with Grand Blue, right? Grand Blue comes from a gacha game. There's a lot of people that want characters from that game, or from Relink, or from this and that. There's probably infinite characters they could add into the game, but you can only add so many. But also, I think justifying the ever escalating price of games is probably another reason people feel like they want big starting rosters, because then in their minds they feel like they're getting their money's worth, because games are expensive nowadays. 60, sometimes $70, sometimes $80. You don't want to feel like you pay all this money, you only get 10 characters, and then you have to pay extra for the new characters that come out afterwards. And again, we get into the territory where like Project L might break the mold a little bit with it, a little bit. I think Melty Blood did free DLC, if I remember correctly. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Melty Blood like released their characters for free, which is really cool. And for that reason, like, people feel probably less of a need to like pressure, right? Because there's a lot of pressure that comes with DLC characters. Like, anytime a modern game is out, they're like, oh shit, when's the next DLC character? We want the next character, we want the next character, we want the next character, where's the next character? This and that. I feel like that probably is severely lessened if the character's free, because like you're gonna get it whenever it shows up, right? But the moment you make people pay for something, they feel they made a purchase, and so they expect something in return, especially if we're talking about buying season passes and stuff like that. So that's how I feel about it. You can leave a comment below with what you would rather prefer. Would you prefer a smaller roster or a bigger roster? Some people feel overwhelmed with a lot of characters whenever they pick up games, so some people just might like smaller rosters in general, at least to start with, so they feel like they have time to get through everything before DLC releases. Because I think some people get stuck into the vortex of like there's all these characters I want to try and this and that, but then there's more characters releasing and they just get overloaded. They just don't know what to do afterwards. So that's how I feel about that one in particular. Thank you for the question. Next one is, when is the right time to stop development on one game and just make a sequel? When will the original lose identity? Man, this is a tough question. This is a really, really tough question. One that thankfully we as consumers do not really have to worry about, because this is like a very, very dev angled question. And so before I give an explicit answer, I want to express how important it is to have a dedicated community manager on games, because they're going to be the person that's gathering the data to make this decision more than anyone, right? They're the person that has like boots on the ground. They're at events, they're talking to people, they're getting opinions, and it's their job to kind of act as the translator to the dev in the community. And like there's always like a climate of a community, and that can change drastically depending on what's going on. Like right now, FGC climate is really, really hot, like hot in a way that there's a lot of heat for a lot of different things, controversy, this and that. Might not be the best time to take a pulse, right? And you know, right after majors, there tends to be like honeymoon phase where like everyone's very happy that things happened, and you know, it's more pleasant. But getting an idea of like when it's best to move on depends on a few things. From like dev end, like, because you got to understand that it's more complicated. It's probably more complicated than you think it is, right? Like devs just don't get the opportunity a lot of the time to just say, hey, we're making a sequel, we're just gonna do it, right? You can do that if you are your own publisher, or you have a publisher that's just like really, really nice and easy to work with. But a lot of the time that's not the case. There's like hoops you have to jump through. There's people you have to answer to. There's like approvals you have to get signed off on, right? And the bigger the IP or the bigger the game is, the more hoops you have to jump through, right? It's just like a really, really long process. But sales factor in, obviously, a big part of like what determines whether it's worth it or not, right? Because that's like the first step, is determining whether it's even worth to make a sequel in the first place. And in some other ways, you have to decide on whether a sequel is the best course of action, or to simply keep supporting the game as it is. And I think like as time goes on, we will probably see more games support for longer, like as live service, right? Because it's easier nowadays to like push updates. You can have updates that are huge, right? That fundamentally change the game entirely, right? Dragon Ball FighterZ had that multiple times. Game like updates that like completely changed the face of the game. Harder for them to do a sequel because Dragon Ball IP is an absolute bitch to work with, right? You have to get approval from everyone, from Toei, from Shueisha, from this, from that. You have to go through Bandai. Like it's a lot to go through for them. It's much easier for them to push an update. That's not the case for everyone though. I think time factors in how long you've been supporting X game. And that's like why DLC is great, because you get to like bridge that gap, right? You get to bridge the gap between, you know, we want to keep supporting this game, and the goal is to support the game until you get the approval for a sequel, perhaps, maybe, hopefully, and then you go from there. But that isn't always the way that it goes. Losing its identity is like this question, this part of the question, I think is very weighted. It comes up more often because people have this idea that if a game belongs to a certain series, that there's a certain core fundamental ideology and identity that it must adhere to for it to be considered part of the series. However, as you will find with many fighting games, even though games are in the same series, they can have severely different gameplay loops, right? They can just play completely different despite being a part of the same series. Some will view this as a very bad thing. Some will view this as a good thing. I tend to think it's a good thing, just because like the idea of what makes a good fighting game, what makes a proper fighting game, changes over time, right? If we keep making games the same way that they were 20 years ago, it just gets stale, right? We're not evolving. We're not getting anywhere, right? But that being said, it causes some pretty ugly discourse sometimes. Like, you guys have probably heard the conversations with Guilty Gear Strive. People like oh shit, Strive's not a real Guilty Gear game because Xrd was like this and Plus R was like this and that. Street Fighter 6 is not a real Street Fighter game because Street Fighter 5 and Street Fighter 4 and Tekken 8 is not a real Tekken game because Tekken 7 and Tekken 6. It's like you will always go through these conversations are inevitable at this point. You're gonna go through them no matter what, even if there's small differences. Some games change way more than others. Like obviously Strive's difference from Xrd is much different from as opposed to like Tekken 8 to Tekken 7, of course. But I think it's not a one size fits all issue, right? Some games are better off making bigger changes to the overall core, and some games are not. They're just they're just not a catch-all. I think it's okay for devs to experiment, and it's okay for them to take creative freedoms and for them to iterate and for them to change and for them to evolve, or else like I said, we just spin our wheels and we just end up playing the same game for 40 years. And I don't know about you guys, but like I just feel like it would get a little stale. A little stale, at least in the eyes of like the modern fighting game fan, especially, right? Like attention spans are not going to be around long enough for you to play the same game for 20 years. They just don't make them like they used to. They simply do not make them like they used to. There are old games that are still played 20 years later, absolutely, but that's few and far between, right? Like it especially as time, like I said, as time goes on, that becomes less and less likely. People are going to want things that feel new, that feel exciting, this and that, sometimes to their own detriment. Sometimes people go overboard and they want to throw out the entire game every patch. They're like, okay, change the game entirely every single patch. You've seen people like that. Those people are also out of their minds, but the idea of a new installment being a different take, a fresh take on a series, the formula is very obviously still there, but we're doing it in a new way. I think it's fine. And I think the modern lineup of games are all doing that. Like pretty much all the big fighting games right now have done that, except for like Uni is pretty close to Uni 1. Like Uni 2 is pretty close to Uni 1. Tekken's pretty different, adding heat and things like that. Street Fighter is very different. Strive is very different. Grand Blue's very different, right? Like they're most of them are like pretty different, and that's fine. That's fine. I don't see the problem. Kingdom Hearts 2 is very different from Kingdom Hearts 1. Many will call Kingdom Hearts 2 the GOAT. You know what I'm saying? It's the same principle applies here. It just be like that. Be like that. Thank you for asking. Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed the answers to these questions, let me know what you think about them in the comments below. And we will see you again once we have more questions to answer, which will probably be tomorrow because I have a pretty long list still. So thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Let me hit